Most cars are created because customers ask for them. The Volkswagen Golf Country was created because a few engineers inside Volkswagen started asking a question nobody else was asking. What if the world's most popular hatchback could leave the pavement behind? Today that sounds completely normal. We call it a crossover. Every manufacturer builds them. They dominate roads from Europe to America. But back in 1990, the idea was so strange that most people didn't even know how to describe it. The Golf Country arrived in a world where cars lived in separate categories. If you wanted a practical family vehicle, you bought a hatchback. If you wanted to go off-road, you bought a Land Rover, a Jeep, or a rugged utility vehicle. Nobody was looking for something in between. Yet Volkswagen was about to build exactly that. The story began during the late 1980s when the Golf Mk2 was one of the most successful cars in Europe. It was everywhere. Families loved it, commuters loved it, and enthusiasts loved it. The GDI had already become a legend, and the Golf's reputation for quality and durability was stronger than ever. Most manufacturers would have looked at that success and played it safe. Volkswagen did the opposite. Engineers began experimenting with the Syncro all-wheel drive system and quickly realized the Golf could go much further than anyone expected. What started as a technical exercise slowly turned into something much more ambitious. Instead of simply improving traction, Volkswagen wanted to create a Golf that could tackle snow-covered mountain roads, muddy trails, gravel tracks, and rough countryside routes while still remaining comfortable enough for everyday driving. It sounded almost ridiculous. A Golf wasn't supposed to do those things. But that's exactly what made the project so interesting. To turn the idea into reality, Volkswagen partnered with Austrian specialist Steyr-Daimler-Puch, a company known for building serious off-road vehicles. Ordinary Golf Syncros arrived at the factory and underwent a dramatic transformation. The suspension was raised significantly. Ground clearance increased. Protective skid plates were installed underneath. Heavy-duty bumpers and brush guards appeared. A spare wheel was mounted on the rear. Suddenly the humble Golf looked like it was preparing for an expedition across the Alps. Yet underneath all the rugged equipment, it was still recognizable as a Golf. That combination made it unlike anything else on the market. When the Golf Country finally reached showrooms in 1990, people were fascinated, but they were also confused. Journalists struggled to categorize it. Customers didn't know whether it was a hatchback, an SUV, or something entirely different. Some loved the adventurous image. Others couldn't understand why anyone would pay extra money for a lifted Golf. The biggest problem wasn't the vehicle itself. The biggest problem was timing. Volkswagen had accidentally built a car for a future market that didn't exist yet. Buyers in 1990 simply weren't thinking the way buyers think today. They didn't want crossovers because crossovers hadn't become part of everyday life. So while the Golf Country impressed many people who drove it, sales never reached the levels Volkswagen hoped for. Only a relatively small number were produced, and before long the model disappeared. At the time, many viewed it as a strange experiment that had failed. But history would tell a very different story. Because over the next 20 years, the entire automotive industry moved in exactly the direction the Golf Country had predicted. Consumers began demanding higher seating positions, all-wheel drive, rugged styling, and vehicles capable of handling more than perfect pavement. Manufacturers rushed to build crossovers of every size imaginable. Suddenly the formula that seemed so bizarre in 1990 became the most successful automotive concept in the world. And that's when enthusiasts started looking back at the Golf Country differently. It wasn't a failure. It wasn't a mistake. It was simply ahead of its time. Long before the Nissan Qashqai, before the Volkswagen Tiguan, before the BMW X1, before the explosion of modern crossovers, there was a lifted Golf quietly proving that ordinary drivers wanted more versatility from their cars. The world just wasn't ready to listen yet. Today, the Golf Country stands as one of the most unusual and fascinating Volkswagens ever built, not because it changed the market overnight, but because it predicted the future years before anyone else could see it coming. The strangest part about the Golf Country is that Volkswagen never truly realized what it had created. The company saw it as an interesting niche model, a way to expand the Golf lineup and experiment with new ideas. Nobody inside Volkswagen was talking about creating a completely new vehicle segment. Nobody was predicting that one day almost every manufacturer on Earth would be building cars based on the exact same philosophy. In many ways, the Golf Country was treated like a curiosity rather than a revolution. Yet the people who actually bought one quickly discovered something special. Unlike traditional off-road vehicles, the Golf Country didn't punish you during daily driving. It wasn't huge. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't difficult to park. It still felt like a Golf. It still fit into city traffic. It still offered the practicality that had made the Golf famous in the first place. But when winter arrived, or when the roads suddenly turned into gravel, mud, or snow, the country revealed why it existed. The additional ground clearance and Syncro all-wheel drive system gave drivers confidence that ordinary hatchbacks simply couldn't match. For people living in mountainous regions, rural areas, or places with harsh winters, the concept made perfect sense. The problem was that most buyers weren't thinking about versatility yet. In 1990, consumers generally chose a car for a specific purpose. A family bought a family car. An off-road enthusiast bought an off-roader. The idea of combining those worlds felt unnecessary. Ironically, that same combination would eventually become one of the biggest automotive trends in history. As the years passed and production ended, the Golf country slowly disappeared from dealerships. Many examples were used exactly as intended. They accumulated high mileage, endured harsh conditions, and quietly carried their owners through everyday life. Some were modified. Some were neglected. Some disappeared entirely. But a funny thing started happening among enthusiasts. The surviving examples became increasingly interesting. People began looking back and realizing how unusual the car had been. This wasn't simply another special edition Golf. This was a vehicle that had predicted the future. Every year that passed made the idea look less ridiculous and more brilliant. Then the crossover boom arrived. Suddenly manufacturers everywhere were producing lifted hatchbacks, compact SUVs, and vehicles designed to blend everyday comfort with a more adventurous image. Consumers loved them. Sales exploded. Entire companies shifted their strategies to focus on crossovers. And that's when the Golf country story became almost unbelievable. Volkswagen had essentially built a crossover decades before crossovers took over the market. The company had the idea. It had the technology. It had the formula. It was simply too early. Looking at a Golf country today feels strangely familiar because modern drivers instantly understand the concept. That's perhaps the biggest compliment you can give the car. What once seemed bizarre now feels completely logical. And yet in 1990 almost nobody could see what Volkswagen's engineers saw. Today, surviving Golf country models have become highly sought after by collectors and enthusiasts. Not because they were the fastest Golfs. Not because they were the rarest Volkswagens. But because they represent one of those rare moments when a manufacturer accidentally looked decades into the future. The Golf country wasn't trying to start a revolution. It wasn't trying to invent the crossover. It simply wanted to be a Golf that could go a little further than the others. But sometimes the most important automotive innovations don't look revolutionary when they first appear. Sometimes they look strange. Sometimes they confuse people. And sometimes the world needs 20 years to understand what it was looking at. The Golf country was one of those cars. A forgotten experiment that quietly became one of the most important Volkswagens ever built. And by the time the rest of the industry finally caught up, the little lifted Golf had already proven its point. What makes the Volkswagen Golf country such a fascinating story isn't the number of cars Volkswagen sold. It isn't the performance figures, the specifications, or even the technology. What makes the Golf country special is that it proved something the automotive world wouldn't fully understand for another 20 years. Sometimes the future arrives long before people are ready for it. When the Golf country appeared in 1990, most buyers saw a strange lifted hatchback that seemed to solve a problem nobody had. They looked at the higher suspension, the rugged styling, the all-wheel drive system, and asked the same question, why? Why would anyone need a Golf that looked like an off-roader? Why pay more money for something that sat awkwardly between two completely different categories? At the time, those questions seemed reasonable. But history has a funny way of changing perspectives. Because if you walk through any modern parking lot today, you'll see exactly why the Golf country mattered. Everywhere you look, there are vehicles following the same basic idea. Practical enough for everyday life. Comfortable enough for long journeys. High enough to handle poor roads. Versatile enough to do a little bit of everything. The formula that seemed so strange in 1990 eventually became the formula that conquered the automotive world. The Golf country didn't fail because it was a bad idea. It struggled because it was an idea from the future. Volkswagen had accidentally built a vehicle for customers who didn't exist yet. And that's what makes it so remarkable today. It wasn't trying to chase a trend. It wasn't trying to copy competitors. It was exploring territory that almost nobody else had even considered. Decades later, surviving examples continue to attract attention wherever they go. Not because they're exotic supercars or ultra-rare collectibles, but because people instantly recognize that they're looking at something unusual. A car that somehow feels both old and modern at the same time. A vehicle from 1990 that makes perfect sense in 2026. Very few automobiles can claim that. Most cars become outdated. Most cars become forgotten. The Golf country became relevant again. And maybe that's the greatest achievement of all. Long before crossovers dominated the roads, long before manufacturers discovered how much people loved versatility, and long before the automotive industry changed forever, there was a small lifted Golf quietly showing everyone what the future might look like. Nobody listened. Nobody understood. But it turned out to be right. And that's why the Volkswagen Golf Country isn't just another forgotten special edition. It's one of the clearest examples of a car that was simply born in the wrong decade. Or perhaps, the right car that arrived at the wrong time.